Morning in Moscow begins with familiar motion. Trains glide silently beneath the ground, carrying millions into another day. Above, wide avenues receive a steady flow of traffic, measured and controlled. Stone facades and glass towers stand under the pale northern light, reflecting a city accustomed to cold and endurance. You hear footsteps echoing through underground corridors, metal doors closing, announcements spoken without urgency. Everything moves with precision, as if the city itself has learned never to hesitate. But if you stand still long enough, something else emerges. Beneath the rhythm of modern life lies a quiet weight. Moscow today is one of Europe's largest cities, home to more than 13 million people. It is the political and economic centre of a vast nation. Yet power here has never been guaranteed. This city has burned, been besieged, abandoned, and rebuilt more than once. The straight avenues were once muddy paths. The great squares were once the edges of forests, where survival depended on vigilance, endurance, and the ability to retreat when necessary. What happened between those two worlds? How did a small outpost, hidden among forests and rivers, become the heart of a state spanning more than 17 million square kilometers? Moscow was not born from the sea or global trade routes. It grew inward, shaped by rivers, land corridors, and the need to defend itself. Its history was written not only by rulers and victories, but by migrations, harsh winters, epidemics, and quiet decisions made under pressure. War, climate, faith, and power layered themselves over generations, forcing this place to adapt or disappear. This is a journey backward through time. From the Moscow of today, we move through the layers beneath its streets, returning to a moment when this city was little more than a wooden fortress beside the Moskva River, surrounded by dense forest and marshland. Through historical records, archaeology, and carefully reconstructed imagery, what has vanished begins to take shape again, not as legend, but as lived experience. This is not a story of effortless rise. It is the story of how a community learned to survive, to hold its ground, and slowly extend its reach between forest and river. You are standing at the edge of a clearing carved out of dense forest. Tall trees press in from every direction, their trunks dark with moisture, their canopies filtering the light into a muted green haze. The ground beneath your feet is uneven, soft in places, hardened in others by repeated footsteps. Ahead, a river curves slowly through marshland. Its surface is dark, almost opaque, moving with a steady patience. Small wooden boats are tied to rough posts along the bank. Smoke rises in thin columns from low structures built close to the ground. You smell wet timber, ash, animal fat, and damp earth. This is not yet a city. It is a foothold. The settlement is compact, cautious by design. A wooden palisade surrounds it, sharpened logs driven deep into the soil. Watchtowers rise only slightly above the tree line, just enough to see without being seen from afar. Inside, buildings are clustered tightly, offering warmth and protection rather than comfort. There are no wide streets, only narrow paths worn by repeated movement. Sound carries easily here. The crack of wood, the murmur of voices, the splash of oars against water. Everything feels provisional, as if it could be dismantled and rebuilt elsewhere if necessary. You are standing in early Moscow, not as a destination, but as a response to its surroundings. This place exists because the land demands it. The rivers of northeastern Rus function as arteries, linking forests, fields, and distant markets. The Moskva River connects to larger waterways, feeding into the Volga basin, allowing movement through otherwise hostile terrain. In a world without paved roads, rivers determine survival. Because this region is surrounded by forest and swamp, Large armies move slowly here. Horses struggle. Supply lines stretch thin. What might seem isolated becomes defensible. Because the land absorbs force, settlements here are not easily erased. Geography does not offer wealth. It offers time. Political power in this period is fragmented. The Ruslands are divided among competing principalities, each vulnerable to shifting alliances and sudden violence. Moscow appears in written records in 1147, mentioned not as a capital, but as a meeting place. Its value lies in neutrality and position. It sits far enough from the open steppe to avoid constant raids, yet close enough to river routes to remain connected. Because no single force dominates the region, survival depends on flexibility. Settlements that grow too fast attract attention. Those that grow quietly endure. Life here reflects this logic. The population is small, likely no more than a few thousand. Families clear narrow strips of land from the forest to grow grain. Fishing supplements diets strained by poor harvests. Hunting provides fur, one of the few commodities valuable enough to trade beyond the region. Wood shapes everything. Homes, walls, tools, even places of worship are built from it. Fire is both necessity and threat. When buildings burn, they are rebuilt quickly, not as monuments, but as functions. Permanence is not the goal. Continuity is. Then the pressure from the east arrives. In the early 13th century, Mongol armies sweep across the Rus lands. Cities built on open plains are devastated. Defensive advantages mean little against overwhelming force. In 1238, Moscow is burned. Its fortifications fail. People are killed or scattered. Yet the destruction is not final. The settlement is not erased from the map. Its location once again matters. It is not the richest prize. It is not the most visible symbol of power. After the armies pass, people return. They rebuild on familiar ground. The forest still stands. The river still flows. By the end of this phase, Moscow remains small, vulnerable, and largely unnoticed. But it has absorbed a lesson that will define its future. In a land without natural borders, where power shifts constantly, survival depends not on strength alone, but on placement, restraint, and the willingness to endure loss without disappearing. This settlement has learned how to remain, and that knowledge will soon attract attention, not from invaders, but from those who see endurance itself as a form of power. You are standing inside a settlement that no longer feels temporary. The palisade still surrounds it, but the logs are thicker, more carefully fitted. Some have been replaced rather than repaired. Inside the walls, the paths are deeper, pressed hard by years of use. Houses stand closer together now, their roofs sloping low to hold in warmth. Smoke hangs heavier in the air, not from a handful of hearths, but from many. Bells ring from more than one church, their sound overlapping, settling into the rhythm of daily life. Boats arrive at the riverbank with greater regularity. You smell grain, leather, tar, and damp wool. Moscow is still cautious, but it is no longer small. This transformation is shaped by submission rather than defiance. After the Mongol conquest, the Ruslands fall under the authority of the Golden Horde. Direct resistance proves catastrophic elsewhere. Cities that challenge openly are destroyed, their populations scattered or killed. Moscow survives by learning how power now moves. Tribute is the new language of rule. Whoever can collect it efficiently, deliver it reliably, and prevent unrest earns protection. Moscow's inland position once again proves decisive. Far from the open steppe, surrounded by forest and marsh, it is difficult to reach quickly and costly to punish repeatedly. Because of this distance, Moscow becomes useful. Its princes accept the role of intermediaries. They gather tribute from surrounding lands and pass it eastward. In return, they receive legitimacy and the right to rule locally. This arrangement changes everything. Because Moscow enforces order on behalf of the horde, it gains authority over neighboring settlements. Because it delivers tribute on time, it is spared the worst reprisals. When uprisings occur elsewhere, Moscow remains intact. Over time, reliability becomes influence. Influence becomes leverage. This system reshapes the political landscape. Rival cities that resist Mongol authority suffer repeated destruction. Moscow does not. People notice. Craftsmen, merchants, clergy, and farmers begin to move toward the city that seems least likely to vanish. Population grows steadily, likely reaching several tens of thousands by the mid-14th century. Wealth accumulates quietly, not through conquest, but through administration. Grain storage improves. Trade becomes more predictable. The river carries not just goods, but information. Moscow becomes a place where decisions are made, recorded, and enforced. Daily life reflects this new stability. Markets operate on regular schedules. Taxes are collected systematically rather than sporadically. The presence of officials becomes normal. Authority is no longer improvised in moments of crisis. It is embedded in routine. The church expands alongside administration, reinforcing hierarchy and continuity. In 1325, the seat of the Russian Orthodox Church is moved to Moscow, a decision that carries enormous weight. Faith brings pilgrims, pilgrims bring resources, resources strengthen institutions. Moscow begins to feel inevitable. But stability has a cost. Dependence on the horde ties Moscow's fortunes to an external power. Tribute drains resources. Loyalty is enforced. When disaster strikes, there is little room for refusal. In 1353, the Black Death reaches the region, killing a significant portion of the population. Moscow suffers deeply, losing leaders and laborers alike, yet its administrative structure holds. Vacancies are filled, tribute continues, life resumes. Where other cities fracture, Moscow absorbs loss and continues functioning. Endurance becomes reputation. As this phase draws to a close, Moscow has changed fundamentally. It is no longer merely a place that survives invasion. It is a place that organizes survival for others. Authority flows toward it not because it is strongest, but because it is dependable. The city has learned how to turn distance into protection and submission into leverage. And in doing so, it has quietly positioned itself at the center of a fragile system that is beginning to weaken. When that system finally cracks, Moscow will be ready to test how much of what it has built can stand on its own. You are standing inside a city that feels alert, almost watchful. The walls still bear the marks of past fires, but they rise higher now, repaired with intention rather than haste. Towers are manned regularly. Bells do not only mark prayer, but signal readiness. The streets feel tighter, more crowded. You hear iron striking iron, the sound of weapons being maintained. Horses crowd the outer yards. Smoke carries a sharper edge, mixed with sweat and metal. Moscow is no longer simply enduring events around it. It is preparing to act. This change is driven by a shift beyond Moscow's control. The power that once dominated the region begins to fracture. The authority of the Golden Horde weakens under internal conflict, succession disputes, and the sheer difficulty of ruling distant territories. Tribute still flows, but enforcement becomes inconsistent. Because Moscow has spent decades building administrative discipline, it notices the change early. Where once there was certainty, there is now delay. Where once punishment was swift, it is now negotiated. Because Moscow already controls tax collection and regional coordination, it can test boundaries without immediate collapse. Leadership plays a decisive role. Under Prince Dmitry Ivanovich, later known as Dmitry Donskoy, Moscow strengthens its defences and builds alliances with neighbouring Ruslands. The logic is cautious but deliberate. Alone, Moscow would fail. United, it might survive a direct challenge. The city's geography still matters. Forests, slow movement, rivers shape routes. Time becomes a weapon. As Mongol authority fragments, Moscow positions itself not as a rebel, but as a focal point for collective action. What begins as coordination becomes leadership. For the people of the city, this shift is tangible. Demands increase. Men are called for military service. Supplies are redirected. Fields are left partially unattended. Anxiety spreads, not through panic, but through silence. Everyone understands the risk. Resistance does not promise freedom. It promises destruction if it fails. Yet something has changed in how that risk is weighed. Moscow's endurance has created trust. People believe the city can survive loss without disappearing. That belief is fragile but powerful. In 1380, that belief is tested. On open ground near the Don River, Moscow leads a coalition of Rus forces against the Mongol army at the Battle of Kulikovo. The fighting is brutal and chaotic. Victory comes at enormous cost. Thousands die. The political order does not collapse overnight. Tribute will be demanded again. Moscow itself will be burned once more in retaliation. But the meaning of the event extends beyond its immediate outcome. For the first time, Mongol forces are defeated in a direct confrontation led by Moscow. The psychological balance shifts. Daily life after the battle is marked by grief and strain. Families mourn the dead. Labour shortages ripple through the countryside. Yet something new takes root. Stories circulate, memory spreads. Resistance is no longer abstract. It has a place, a date, a cost. Churches commemorate the fallen. The idea that Moscow can act on behalf of others becomes embedded in identity. Authority begins to feel earned rather than imposed. As this phase comes to an end, Moscow stands at a threshold. It has not broken free from domination, but it has crossed an invisible line. It has moved from survival to assertion. The city now carries expectations placed upon it by others, expectations shaped by shared sacrifice. What comes next will not be decided on the battlefield alone, but in how Moscow transforms symbolic leadership into lasting control. The struggle ahead will be quieter, longer, and far more decisive than open war. You are walking through a city that feels heavier, more deliberate. The walls are no longer simply repaired after disaster. They are rebuilt with purpose. Stone begins to dominate the center. The Kremlin rises more clearly defined than before, its mass pressing down on the surrounding streets. Bells ring at fixed hours. Officials move with documents in hand. Courtyards are organized. Storage buildings stand guarded. Authority is no longer improvised in moments of danger. It is present every day, visible and routine. Moscow has entered a different phase of its life. This transformation is driven by consolidation rather than confrontation. After the shock of open resistance, Moscow turns inward. The lesson of the late 14th century is clear. Symbolic victory alone cannot sustain power. Control must be made permanent. Over decades, Moscow absorbs neighboring principalities through marriage alliances, inheritance, purchase, and pressure. Where resistance appears, it is isolated. Where cooperation is offered, it is rewarded. Because Moscow already manages taxation and administration, expansion feels gradual, almost administrative. Borders change quietly. Maps simplify without dramatic collapse. Leadership shapes this process decisively. Under the rule of Ivan III, Moscow stops acting like a regional coordinator and begins acting like a sovereign centre. Tribute to the horde is withheld. Authority is asserted without spectacle. In 1480, the final standoff with Mongol power ends not in a decisive battle, but in withdrawal. Control shifts through exhaustion rather than victory. By the end of the century, Moscow governs territories several times larger than it did 100 years earlier. Power is no longer borrowed. It is assumed. This centralization reshapes the city's internal life. Administration expands. Law becomes standardized. Loyalty is redirected upward, away from local princes and toward the center. The church reinforces this hierarchy, framing obedience as order and continuity. Stone churches replace wooden ones. Ritual becomes uniform. Moscow presents itself not as one city among many, but as the axis around which others turn. Stability becomes ideology. For ordinary people, life becomes more predictable, but also more constrained. Taxes are collected regularly. Military obligations are formalized. Mobility decreases as land and labour are tied more tightly to authority. Markets grow, but oversight increases. The forest still surrounds the city, but retreat is no longer an option. Moscow does not hide anymore. It absorbs, organizes, and directs. Survival has evolved into governance. As this phase draws to a close, Moscow is no longer defined by what it resists. It is defined by what it controls. The city that once survived by remaining unnoticed now stands as an unavoidable center. Patience has been converted into dominance, and with its rivals subdued and its institutions hardened, Moscow is poised to move beyond consolidation towards something larger. The question ahead is no longer whether Moscow can endure pressure, but how far its influence will reach when endurance becomes command. You are back in the present. Trains still glide beneath Moscow, carrying millions through tunnels carved deep into the earth. Streets pulse with movement. Glass and stone reflect a city that appears confident, permanent, immovable. Yet, when you look closer, the past has not vanished. The curve of the Moskva River still shapes the city's flow. The Kremlin still occupies higher ground, not by accident, but by memory. Beneath asphalt and steel lie older layers, burned and rebuilt many times. Moscow still moves the way it learned to move centuries ago. Cautious, inward-looking, prepared. What once were forests and marshes are now districts and avenues, but the logic remains. This is a city that learned to survive before it learned to dominate, and it has never forgotten that order. The history of Moscow is not a story of effortless ascent. It is a story of adaptation under pressure, of choosing endurance over display, of learning when to submit, when to wait, and when to act. Again and again, people here faced forces larger than themselves. Climate, invasion, disease, authority. They made compromises. They accepted limits. And when conditions shifted, those same compromises became tools of expansion. Moscow reminds us that power does not always emerge from boldness. Often, it grows from restraint, from memory, from the ability to endure loss without losing direction. Ambition here was shaped by fear as much as confidence, by survival as much as vision. As you leave this story, the city does not offer a simple lesson. It invites a question. How many other places were shaped not by triumph, but by patience? Not by conquest, but by endurance? And how many decisions that once seemed small, cautious, even submissive, later became foundations of power? History does not announce its turning points when they happen. It reveals them only in hindsight. Moscow stands as a reminder that what endures longest often shapes the future most deeply. And somewhere beneath the noise of the present, those older rhythms are still there, waiting to be noticed again.
The capital sleeps, a quiet endurance beneath the Kremlin stars, waiting for the new century.
Here, in the shadow of the Kremlin, every stone tells a story of Russia's complex and enduring past, layered within the vibrant